People ask me sometimes how I ended up here. Outpost Yedril 9, they say, raising an eyebrow like that's the punchline. Middle of the Sondrath Drift, 3 relay hops from the nearest inhabited system, a station so far from everything that the supply haulers only bother swinging by once every 6 weeks. They look at the rank on my collar, Maintenance Coordinator, Grade 7, which is the kind of title that exists so a payroll system has something to file, and they look at the station's cracked observation windows and the permanent smell of hydraulic sealant and recycled water, and they say, "How does a man end up here?" I usually tell them I requested it. That part is true, I did request it, I just don't generally bother to explain why. The short answer is that I got myself reassigned from Outpost KL7, roughly 14 years ago, and Yedril 9 was what became available. The slightly longer answer involves a freighter, a service conduit, a small creature with silver hair and eyes the color of deep water, and the 6 weeks I spent lying to everyone with authority over me. The real answer, the one I have never told in full, not because it shames me, but because no one has ever seemed worth the length of it, is that a child needed a janitor more than she needed a hero, and I happened to be the janitor on duty. I was 41 when I was posted to KL7, not a glamorous number in any ledger. I had spent 19 years doing maintenance work on frontier outposts and transit stations, the kind of postings that nobody fights over, the ones that come up on the board with a 2-week window before they're filled by default, because the only people who apply are the people who have run out of better options, or the people who have decided, quietly and without drama, that they prefer the company of malfunctioning atmospheric processors to the company of other human beings. I was somewhere between both. My back hurt in cold weather. I was good at what I did. I didn't need much else. KL7 was a transit and compliance station in the Vori Fringe Governance Zone Outer 7, which meant it was far enough from the core systems that the rules had a kind of soft, interpretable quality, the way rules do when the people writing them can't quite see the places they govern. The station processed cargo manifests, held vessels for inspection when the compliance officers deemed it necessary, and served as a refueling node for the freight corridor running between the Thessan colonies and the outer reaches of the Marit sovereignty. It was not a pleasant place. Compliance zones rarely are. The officers who staffed the inspection divisions had that particular brand of pettiness that comes from being granted a small amount of power in a place where nothing else of consequence ever happens. They were thorough in the way that bored men with authority are always thorough, not because they cared about the law exactly, but because finding a violation was the only interesting thing their day had to offer. I ran atmospheric maintenance and the waste exchange network, the unglamorous circulatory system of any station, the set of tunnels and conduits and filtration chambers that everyone depends on and no one thinks about until something goes wrong. I had one assistant, a young man named Park who was diligent with a wrench and mostly silent, which suited me well. We kept to ourselves, we kept the station breathing, that was the arrangement. The freighter came in on a Tuesday, which I only remember because Park had taken the day for a medical check, and I was alone in the lower maintenance bay when the docking alert sounded. The vessel was called the Orinth Passage, a Maritregistry cargo hauler, broad-hulled and battered, the kind of ship that has been repainted enough times that the original color is a matter of speculation. It was flagged for a compliance inspection. That happened 2 or 3 times a week. I didn't pay it much attention. What I did notice, about 4 hours into the inspection cycle, was a smell. Maintenance work teaches you to notice smells. An outpost is a system, and systems communicate through their failures. A burnt wire smell means something electrical is throwing heat it shouldn't. A sweet, slightly sour smell in the recycled air flow means a biological seal is beginning to break down somewhere. I was running a diagnostic on a pressure exchange junction in Conduit 7, a long, low crawlspace that ran parallel to the station's main docking arm, when I caught something that didn't belong to the station's usual catalog of odors. Something organic and faint, like dried vegetation, and something else underneath it, something I couldn't name. Slightly mineral. Alive was the word that came to me. Whatever that smell was, it was alive in a way the station generally wasn't. I followed it. The conduit branched near the midpoint of the docking arm, a secondary run that served the environmental exchange between the station's hull and the docked vessels. It was narrow enough that I had to proceed on elbows and knees, my work lamp cutting a white circle ahead of me. The smell grew stronger. The conduit curved, and there was a section where the original panel had been retrofitted, poorly, by someone who didn't know the spec. And there was a gap between the old fitting and the new one, a space of perhaps 30 centimeters that had been packed with what appeared to be thermal wrap salvaged from a cargo pallet. I pulled the wrap aside. The child was curled behind it, in the space between the retrofit fitting and the original wall. She was small, truly small, smaller than my forearm, sitting with her knees drawn up and one hand pressed flat against the conduit wall in the way of a creature that has learned to measure escape routes before it measures anything else. Her skin was the blue of deep ice, not quite uniform. There was a faint luminosity to it that shifted when she moved, something between bioluminescence and the kind of sheen you see on certain materials when light strikes them at a low angle. Her ears came to narrow points. Her eyes, when they turned to look at me, and they turned to look at me immediately, which told me she had known I was coming long before I arrived, were a deep, clear silver, large enough that they seemed to occupy half her face. She wore what had once been a robe of some kind, short layers of pale fabric that had been torn and folded and retied until it fit her. She was thin, not alarmingly so, but thin in the way that says food has not been a reliable fixture. Her silver hair was matted in places and clean in others, the way hair gets when someone is trying to maintain some dignity against difficult conditions. She looked at me. I looked at her. I was aware in that moment of the full weight of what was happening. An alien child, alone, concealed in my station's maintenance conduit, was looking at me from behind a piece of salvaged thermal wrap. She had come off the Orinth Passage, which was currently in the docking arm under compliance inspection. The compliance officers were somewhere on the other side of that docking arm. They were looking for irregular cargo. They were very good at finding irregular cargo. I said in the most ordinary voice I could produce, "Are you hurt?" I didn't know if she spoke standard. She probably didn't. I said it anyway because it was the true and relevant question, and because tone crosses most language barriers if you get it right. She looked at my lamp, then at my hands, then at my face. Then she held up her hand, a small thing, 4 fingers, slightly longer than a human child's proportionally, and she showed me her palm, empty, an old signal. I recognized it across the gulf of whatever species she was. "I'm not a threat," that gesture said. "Please don't be one either." I said, "All right." I turned off my lamp. We sat in the dark of the conduit for a moment. I could hear the inspection team somewhere above us, their boots on the docking arms grating. I could hear her breathing, which was quiet and even, the breathing of someone who has had a great deal of practice at being still and silent in small spaces. I turned the lamp back on, setting it to its lowest setting, barely enough to read by. I opened my maintenance pack. I carried rations in my pack, not because regulations required it, though they did, but because I tended to work through scheduled meal breaks and had learned to keep something on hand. What I had that day was a compressed protein block, a foil of dried grain meal, and a water canteen. I took the canteen first, because water is what you offer first, and I held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at me. She reached out and took it, both hands, and drank from it with the practiced care of someone who has been rationing water and doesn't quite trust that there's more where this came from. She drank, stopped, looked at me again, checking, I thought, whether I intended to take it back, and when I didn't move, she drank again. Then she handed the canteen back. Precise. She wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. I held out the grain meal. She took that too, ate it slowly, didn't look away from me while she did it. She was calculating something. I let her calculate. When she was done, she set the empty foil on the conduit floor with a kind of finicky neatness that I liked. There was something in that gesture, the carefulness of it, the small dignity that told me something about who she was, or who she had been before whatever had happened to her had happened. I said, "I'm not going to bring anyone here." She tilted her head. The motion was slightly wrong for a human, a degree or two too far, and held a beat too long, but the intent of it was the same. She was listening to the tone more than the words. I said, "You can stay here tonight. The inspection team will finish by second cycle. After that, we can work something out." She studied me. Then she reached into the folds of her robe and took out a small object and held it toward me. It was a carved figure, no bigger than my thumb, made from something dark and close-grained, possibly wood of some kind, though the material had a slight warmth that suggested it might have been something else entirely. The figure was abstract, more suggestion than form, but it resolved into a shape if you looked at it. A tall, standing figure with one hand extended downward, and a small figure at its feet. The carving was worn smooth in the places that hands hold a thing most often. She had held this thing many times. It was important. She was offering it to me. I shook my head gently and folded her fingers back around it. "That's yours," I said. "Keep it." She looked at her hand, then at me. Then she tucked the figure back into her robe and sat back against the conduit wall with the air of someone who has just completed a significant calculation and arrived at a provisional answer. I left her water in the protein block, and I went back to work. That night, Kale 7 ran on a 30-hour cycle, which never quite sat right with my human biology. I lay on my bunk in the maintenance staff quarters and looked at the ceiling and thought carefully about what I was doing. The compliance officers would have filed their inspection report by morning. The Orinth passage would be cleared or impounded or fined, and it would move on, and the child in my conduit would be without whatever arrangement had gotten her this far. I didn't know where she'd come from. I didn't know what she was running from. I had a reasonable guess, given the type of vessel, given the compliance zone, given the state of her clothing and the practiced way she'd measured me for threat. I had a reasonable guess, but I didn't know. What I knew was what I'd seen, which was a child alone in a maintenance conduit eating grain meal out of my hand, and the way she'd held that carved figure out to me like an offering, and then held it tight when I gave it back. I decided I was going to need to be very careful and very quiet for the next few days. Her name, or what I came to call her, because her actual name was a sound I couldn't reproduce with a human throat, was Vane. She offered it to me on the second day, the way you might test a word to see if another person can handle it, pressing 2 fingers briefly to her sternum and making a sound like water over flat stone. I tried it. I failed. She watched me fail 3 times with an expression that I can only describe as patient amusement, the first thing approaching ease I'd seen in her face, and then she tried a shorter version, just the first sound of it. I tried that. She tilted her head. "Acceptable," that tilt said. "Vane." She came from the Verath sovereignty, which was a governance body I had only a passing knowledge of, a cluster of systems in the outer Merit region, ethnically and politically complex in ways I was not qualified to untangle. What I could piece together from her, through gesture and the few words of Merit trade pidgin she seemed to have, and the few words of her own language she seemed to think I might understand if she repeated them slowly enough, was that there had been something that had fractured her family's situation. Something to do with faction politics and a border dispute, and the particular kind of violence that erupts when those 2 things meet in a place that neither of the larger governance bodies wants to officially acknowledge. The family, she had a family somewhere. I was clear on that, though the shape of it was vague, had made arrangements for her to travel. The arrangements had not held the whole way. She'd ended up in a cargo container on the Orinth Passage. The crew had not been kind exactly, but they had not interfered with her. When the vessel was flagged for inspection, she'd made a decision and moved through a cargo hatch and into the station's environmental conduit, which was the kind of decision that a child shouldn't have to make, and which she'd made with the calm precision of someone who'd made worse decisions under worse circumstances. The inspection found nothing. The Orinth Passage was cleared and departed on the second day. I moved Vane that night's second cycle, when the compliance team and most of the station staff were in their quarters, out of the conduit and into the atmospheric maintenance sub-bay, a small room behind the primary filtration units that was technically on my duty log as a weekly inspection point, and which no one else had any reason to enter. It was warm. It was dry. It had a storage shelf that was empty of everything except a spare set of filter housings. I took the housings out and put in a folded thermal blanket and a flat cushion from the break room that I was reasonably confident no one had noticed in some time. She looked at the shelf, she looked at me, she got in. I left a second canteen, a full ration pack, and a small task lamp that she could operate with a single press. I showed her the on-off twice. She watched my hand once and then did it herself twice to confirm she had it. I said, "I'll be back in the morning." She looked at me with those deep silver eyes, and I had the distinct impression that she was reserving judgment, which seemed fair. The next 14 days were the most careful I have ever lived. I ran my duty log as normal. I ate in the staff canteen at the usual hours. I filed my reports to the station administrator, a man named Gorse who was primarily interested in his own comfort and secondarily interested in the compliance team's approval numbers, and who paid about as much attention to his maintenance coordinator as he paid to the station's atmospheric processors. Which is to say, no attention at all unless something went wrong. I made sure nothing went wrong. I brought Vane food every day. Rations first, then, when I'd accumulated enough credit in the station's commissary account, actual meals from the galley, packed in sealed containers I could carry in my kit bag without comment. I learned what she would eat and what she would not. She had a strong preference for anything with vegetable content and a complete indifference to protein compounds, and I adjusted accordingly. She ate precisely and without waste, the same neatness I'd seen on the first day, and she always handed back the containers clean, which was the kind of behavior that told you something about a person's upbringing even when you couldn't ask about it directly. We found a way to communicate. It was slow and partial, and required a patience that I suspect only a child and a maintenance worker could sustain, but it built itself out of repetition and correction, and the occasional stroke of luck when a word in one language had a sound close enough to a word in another. She was faster at it than I was. She had a precision with language, the way she registered a word, tested it against its context, filed it, and produced it accurately an hour later, that reminded me of a diagnostic tool running a fault tree analysis. Systematic, nothing wasted. On the fourth day she started asking about the station. Not in words, not at first. She would point at the junction housings, at the filter arrays, at the pipes and their seals, and make a questioning gesture. I described what each component did, in the simplest standard I could manage. She listened. She pointed again, following the logic of it. This feeds into that which connects to the other. She was tracing the system, understanding the architecture of the place she was in, which is what anyone with any sense does when they find themselves somewhere that might become dangerous or might become necessary to navigate quickly. By the 6th day, she was teaching me things in return. She had seen my maintenance log. I'd had it out while running a pressure check, and she'd watched me write it, and she drew in the margin of a scrap of filter paper a diagram of a pressure equalization system that was slightly different from the one I was using, more elegant in its branch configuration, with fewer junctions at risk of fouling. I looked at it for a while. It was better than what I had. I wasn't sure how a child hiding in a maintenance conduit had come to know more about pressure equalization systems than the maintenance coordinator running them. And then I thought about her robe, the torn ceremonial fabric, the way it had been refashioned, and about the carved figure and the genealogy she'd alluded to, and I thought, she knows things because someone taught her, and someone taught her because she was expected to know things. And the question of why a person of her background would need to know how pressure equalization systems work in a transit station was a question I probably didn't need answered to do what I needed to do. I used her diagram. The system ran cleaner for it. I logged the modification without attribution. In those 14 days I learned in pieces more about what she was running from. There was a faction. I never got a name for it, or not one that I could hear clearly. It sounded like a grinding consonant and then silence, which was probably significant, that had come to hold considerable power in the border systems of the Varath sovereignty after the ceasefire. They had a particular interest in certain lineages. Vane was of one of those lineages. The details of why, and the full genealogical architecture of Varath politics, were beyond what we could build between us with trade pigeon and gesture and 14 days. What came through clearly, because she said it several ways until I understood it, was that the people looking for her had resources, and they had contacts in the compliance networks of the governance zones, and they were patient. She said that last word, or something that meant it, 3 times. Patient. She pressed her fingers together and held them there slowly to illustrate. Patient in the way of people who can afford to wait because they know their target has nowhere to go. I thought about that. I thought about it for the better part of 2 days, in the gaps between maintenance tasks, while I was running diagnostics and testing seals and writing up inspection reports and doing all the ordinary work that formed the visible surface of my days. The thinking happened underneath, in the quiet mechanical layer of the mind that keeps running while your hands are busy. It's the same layer that tells you a pressure reading is wrong 3 seconds before you've consciously registered the number. The same layer that notices the smell in a conduit that doesn't belong there. What the thinking produced by the end of the 2nd day was a clear picture of the problem. Vane could not stay on KL7. The compliance officers had finished their inspection of the Orinth passage and moved on, but the inquiry that was running, the one with patients behind it, would eventually reach the governance zone Outer 7 network. When it did, KL7 would be on the list of stations the Orinth passage had transited through. A juvenile unauthorized passenger inquiry, routed through the compliance network, would produce interviews. Gorse would cooperate fully and with enthusiasm. The compliance officers would be thorough, because being thorough was the only interesting thing their day offered. They would inspect the conduit systems. They would find the thermal wrap I had stuffed back into the gap. That gave me a window. How long the window was depended on how efficient the inquiry's routing was, and on whether anyone had already flagged KL7 specifically or was still casting wide. My estimate for planning purposes was 3 weeks. This was probably optimistic. I planned for 2. Vane could also not leave through official channels. No transit documents, no registered identity in the governance zone system, no species ID on file. The Varath sovereignty had never submitted biometric registration data to the zone's compliance authority, which was a deliberate political stance, and also, in this specific case, a practical complication. Any official boarding process would require identity verification. She had none to give. I also thought about the compliance team on KL7, and their contacts in the broader compliance network, and about Gorse, who answered to the governance zone auditor and who would roll over for an inquiry faster than his chair could spin. I started planning. The neutral flag haulers were the answer. The fringe had a loose category of registry, vessels that flew under flags of systems that had signed neither the Merit Accords nor the governance zone compacts, which meant they operated in a kind of supervised ambiguity that the compliance teams couldn't touch directly. They could be flagged. They could be inspected. But their manifest records went to a different authority, and if you had cargo that needed to move without appearing in the governance zone system, a neutral flag hauler was how you moved it. There was one on the docking schedule. The Tessavar, out of the Kern Independency, due in on day 16 for a resupply stop. It would stay approximately 18 hours. Its captain, I pulled the vessel profile from the station's transit log, was a woman named Orve Dunn, Kern National, 61 years old, 12 years on the fringe route. Long-haul fringe captains of that tenure had a practical ethics. They didn't ask questions that made their lives complicated, and they didn't answer questions that made other people's lives complicated. They kept their ships running, they moved their cargo, and they stayed out of the compliance team's ledgers. I needed to get to Orve Dunn, without the compliance team seeing me do it. I spent 3 days working through the problem. The solution was not elegant. It relied on the fact that refueling connections on the KL-7 docking arm ran through the maintenance subdeck, which meant I had legitimate business near any docked vessel's berthing section during a resupply stop. It relied on the fact that the compliance team's inspection of a neutral flag hauler was limited to a brief manifest review, usually conducted at the primary docking collar, and lasting no more than 90 minutes. And it relied on the fact that I had been on this station long enough to know exactly which surveillance nodes in the maintenance subdeck had been flagged for replacement for the past 2 years, without anyone ever actually replacing them. I left the functioning ones alone. I walked the route through the ones that didn't work. I met Captain Dunn in the Tessavar's fuel coupling maintenance access. She was running a routine line check herself, which told me something about the kind of captain she was, and I said what I needed to say, plainly and without embellishment. There was a child. She needed to reach the Kern Independency, or any system outside Governance Zone Outer 7. She had no transit documents and no registered identity in the Governance Zone system, and the people looking for her had access to the compliance network. I could pay what I had. I showed her the figure. I had thought about how to make this approach, and the conclusion I'd reached was that the only approach with any chance of working was the direct one. Not because I had any reason to trust a stranger, but because a stranger capable of running a neutral flag fringe route for 12 years had already made a particular set of decisions about the world, and those decisions were legible in the way they operated. You didn't survive 12 years on the fringe by being naive. You also didn't survive 12 years by being the kind of person who handed children to compliance teams for the fee. The two things were not compatible. I was betting that Orve Dunn was the second kind of person, and I was prepared to be wrong. I was not wrong. Orve Dunn was a compact woman, gray-haired, with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades in ships with imperfect atmospheric systems. She looked at the number. She looked at me. She said she's sick. I said no, thin, not sick. She said she scream. I said no. She said, you sure? I said, she's the quietest person I've met in 20 years. Orve Dunn thought about this. She had the particular stillness of someone running their own fault tree analysis. She said, I've got a cargo hold with a rated environmental subcompartment. It's listed as temperature-sensitive goods. Compliance doesn't open that one without a hazmat declaration and a 2-day notice. She paused. You get her to the fuel coupling access by 300-second cycle. You stay off the surveillance track I'm about to tell you. She told me the track. I memorized it. She said, price is what you offered and one favor. I said, what favor? She said, you tell no one, not the station. Not anyone who might tell the station. You file no complaint and you give no statements. I said, that was already my plan. She said, then we're done here. She went back to her line check. I went back to the atmospheric sub-bay by a different route, and I sat on the floor beside Vane's storage shelf, not saying anything, just letting the plan settle into its final shape. She watched me from the shelf with her legs folded under her and the thermal blanket across her knees, which was what she did when she was being patient. After a while, she reached over and tapped my hand, once lightly, a question that didn't need words. I held up 2 fingers. 2 days. She nodded and went back to being still. I have worked with a great many people over the course of my career. I have rarely worked alongside anyone who understood as instinctively as Vane did that sometimes the most productive thing you can do is be present and quiet and not require anything of the other person until they're ready to move. It is a rarer skill than people realize. Most people in uncertainty fill the space with noise. She filled it with attention. There is a difference. Moving Vane from the atmospheric sub-bay to the fuel coupling access at 300 was the part I had spent the most time on, because it was the part where a mistake would end everything. The route I had planned ran through 3 sections of maintenance conduit, 2 of which Vane had already seen, down a service ladder to the subdeck, across 40 meters of storage corridor, and into the fuel coupling access through a side hatch that was listed on my maintenance log as a quarterly pressure test point. I had scheduled the pressure test for that cycle. It was entirely legitimate in the log. It was the only part of the operation that was. I went to the sub-bay at 200. I had brought her the carved figure, which was absurd, because she'd never given it to me. It had been in her robe the whole time, and then I realized I was thinking about it because I was nervous, and I made myself stop. She was awake when I arrived. She was always awake when I arrived. I was not entirely sure when or whether she slept. She was sitting on the storage shelf with the thermal blanket folded precisely across her knees and the task lamp set to its lowest setting, and she looked at me when I came in with an expression that I can only describe as prepared. She had known from the past day or 2 of my behavior that something was coming. She had not asked. She'd waited. I said, "Tonight." She looked at me. I said, "There's a ship. Captain's name is Orphan. She'll take you somewhere safe." I had no idea if this was precisely true. Safe was a large word. What I could say with confidence was somewhere further from the compliance network, somewhere off the route that the patient people would be running when they came through the KL7 records looking for her. "She's a good person," I said, which was also a guess but a considered one. Vane looked at her hands, then she looked at me. She reached into her robe and took out the carved figure and held it out to me again. I looked at it for a moment. The 2 figures, the tall one with the extended hand, the small one at its feet. I thought about the first time she'd offered it and what I'd said, "That's yours, keep it." I thought about the fact that she was offering it again and what that meant, that she wasn't offering it because she didn't want it. She was offering it because it was the most valuable thing she had. I took it. I held it for a moment, feeling the warmth of it, the worn smoothness of it. Then I put it in my chest pocket, where I keep things I want to have with me. She watched me do that. Something in her face settled. I said, "Ready." She got up off the shelf, folded the blanket, still the same neatness, right to the end and laid it on the shelf, and she looked at me and gave me the smallest nod I have ever received from another person. We went. The route took 19 minutes. I had estimated 22. She moved through the conduit sections faster than I had accounted for, quieter, better at reading the junctions. She was following my lamp, but she was also reading the space itself, the way someone moves through territory they've had time to study. In the storage corridor, she stayed a half step behind me and matched my pace exactly, which is not something most people can do instinctively, and which told me again that she had been in situations before where being exactly as loud as the person in front of you was what kept you alive. Captain Dunn was at the fuel coupling side, hatch exactly where she said she'd be. She looked at Vane. Vane looked at her. Dunn said, "Hello." Vane said something in her own language, short, 2 syllables. Dunn looked at me. I said, "I think it's a greeting." Dunn said, "Good enough." She looked back at Vane and made a follow-me gesture, economical and clear. Vane followed. She didn't look back at me. She walked through the hatch and into the Tessevar's maintenance access corridor, and Orve Dunn sealed the hatch behind them. I stood in the storage corridor for a moment. Then I went and did my pressure test, because it was in the log and I wanted the log to be accurate. The Tessevar departed at 6:20. I was running a filter inspection on the secondary atmospheric loop when the docking alert sounded. I noted the departure time in my log. I kept working. Gorse called me to his office 6 days later. The compliance team had received an inquiry. He didn't say from whom, but the shape of it was clear enough, regarding a juvenile unauthorized passenger, potentially having transited through KL7. Had I, in the course of my maintenance duties, observed anything unusual in the station's conduit systems or service areas? I said that I had not. He looked at me. Gorse was not an unintelligent man. He was simply a man whose intelligence was entirely deployed in service of his own comfort and advancement, which meant that, when he looked at you, he was calculating whether you were a risk to those things rather than whether you were telling the truth. He looked at me for a long moment. He said the compliance team would appreciate my full cooperation if any further inquiry was made. I said, of course. He said that he was noting our conversation in the administrative file. I said that seemed appropriate. I went back to work. 3 weeks later, I received my reassignment notice. The language was bureaucratic and neutral, the kind of neutral that is constructed very carefully so that it says nothing actionable. Routine rotation of station personnel. New posting available. Outpost Yedril 9, Sondrath Drift. Report date in 30 days. I read it twice. Then I packed my kit because there wasn't much to pack, and I put in my notice with Gorse, who received it with barely concealed relief, and I left Kale 7 on the next hauler out. I've been at Yedril 9 for 14 years. It is, as I noted, not a glamorous posting. The station is old and the components are old and the supply runs are infrequent, and the staff roster runs to 7 people on a good rotation. We have a small survey team that comes through twice a year, a relay maintenance crew that passes every 4 months, and the occasional neutral flag hauler stopping for fuel. We are not on any diplomatic route. We are not on any military route. We are on the kind of route that exists because the drift needs relay stations, and the relay stations need maintenance coordinators, and someone has to fill the slot. I am good at my job. I have made the station run better than it has run in probably 2 decades. I have replaced the observation window seals 3 times and the atmospheric filtration twice, and rewired the primary distribution network in a way that actually matches the original specifications, which the previous maintenance teams appear to have treated as a loose suggestion. The station runs well. It is quiet. The other staff are decent people who leave me alone, which I appreciate. The work itself has never bothered me. People misunderstand maintenance work, I think, because they confuse it with servitude. It isn't. Maintenance is the work of keeping a system honest, of insisting, every day, that things function the way they were designed to function, and finding out why they don't when they don't. There is a satisfaction in it that doesn't depend on anyone noticing. The atmospheric processor doesn't care whether you're appreciated. It either runs correctly or it doesn't. That clarity has always suited me. What the 14 years at Yedril 9 gave me, beyond the usual wear, was time. Time to do the work properly, without the low-grade friction of a compliance-heavy station and a disengaged administrator. Time to think. Time to be still with the carved figure on the shelf and not require it to mean anything in particular. There is a thing that happens when you stop needing an experience to resolve into meaning. It stops being something you carry and becomes simply something that happened, laid into the architecture of you the way a replaced fitting becomes part of a pipe. Invisible, functional, load-bearing. I keep the carved figure on my bunk shelf. Not prominently, it's a small thing and the shelf has other objects on it. A transit almanac I've had since my second posting. A flat pic of a mountain range on Earth that I have never visited but have always intended to. A spare calibration tool that I keep there because I keep misplacing the one on my belt. The carved figure sits among these things and doesn't announce itself. But it's there. I look at it occasionally. Not often. I don't dwell on things. I had, in 14 years, heard nothing. I had looked early on, carefully, not in any way that would have shown up in the compliance network, for any information about the situation in the Varath sovereignty. The border dispute had eventually resolved, in the way these things resolve, inconclusively, with a document that satisfied neither party but exhausted both. The faction that had held power in the fringe systems had lost influence in a subsequent internal realignment. The patrol networks that had been flagging neutral flag haulers for juvenile passenger inquiries had gone quiet within 2 years of Vane's departure. I didn't know what any of that meant for her specifically. I took it as good news and let myself believe it. I had not been contacted by Captain Dunn or anyone from the Tessavar. I had not expected to be. I had not been contacted by anyone claiming to be Vane or to speak for her. I had not expected that either. You help a child because a child needs help. That's the whole equation. You don't help a child in order to be thanked later. You don't help a child and then wait around to find out what she grew up to be. You help her because she's there, and she needs it, and you're the one who happens to be standing in that maintenance conduit with a water canteen and a ration pack, and enough sense to keep your mouth shut. I understood all of this clearly. I still kept the carved figure on the shelf. The diplomatic vessel arrived on a Thursday. I knew it was coming because the relay array picked up its transponder signal 26 hours out, which is more than enough warning to alert the station staff and prepare a docking reception, and generally behave as though Yedril 9 receives diplomatic vessels on a regular basis, which it emphatically does not. I ran a check on the transponder registration while Hemara, my current assistant, better with electronics than Park had been, worse with a wrench, stared at the readout. Hemara said, "That's a Varath registry." I said, "I see that." She said, "What's a Varath diplomatic ship doing at Yedril 9? I said, "I imagine we'll find out." The vessel was not large. Diplomatic vessels in the outer systems rarely are. The great ceremonial ships are for the inner corridors, where there are cameras and records and people who care about the size of your hull. This was a practical ship, well maintained, with the clean lines of something that travels far and often. It docked without incident. The docking collar sealed. I was standing in the station's receiving bay, because I am the station's senior staff member and these things fall to me, when the hatch opened. There were 3 people in the delegation. 2 of them I catalogued briefly. An aide of some kind, young, carrying a document case, and a security officer, composed and watchful, who scanned the bay with the systematic attention of someone who does it professionally. I noted them, and then I looked at the third person and I stopped. She was taller than I had imagined she would be, though I hadn't let myself imagine much. Her skin was the blue of deep ice, not quite uniform, with that faint luminosity that shifted when she moved. Her ears came to narrow points. Her hair was dark now, not silver, pulled back and formal. Her eyes were a deep, clear silver, and they were very large in a way that I had remembered accurately even after 14 years, and they were looking at me with an expression that I needed a moment to read. Not because it was unfamiliar. Because it was the same expression she'd had when she'd handed me the canteen back on the second day, in the conduit, after she'd drunk from it, and confirmed that I wasn't going to take it away from her. The expression of someone who has completed a significant calculation and arrived at an answer they're not quite ready to release. She said my name. Not the short version, not the polite abbreviation that everyone on the station uses. My full name, all 3 syllables of it, in a way that suggested she'd known the full version for a long time and had been keeping it for exactly this moment. I said, "Hello, Vane." She looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. 14 years of deep drift posting does something to a person's face. I was aware of the gray at my temples and the deeper line of my jaw and all the other small accounts that time keeps. She looked at me the way you look at something you've been carrying in your memory and are now measuring against the original. Then she said, in standard that was not just fluent but precise, with an accent that was Varath-inflected and something else underneath it, "Kern," I thought. She'd spent time in the Independency, she said. "You gave me your water first." I said, "It's what you offer first." She said, "You also gave me your ration pack." I said, "You were thin." She said, "You turned off the lamp." I said, "Seemed polite." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have spent 14 years in the outer system. I have worked in 6 governments and traveled on 31 vessels and been in 3 situations that came close to the one I was in when I came aboard KL-7. She said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact that everyone in the conversation already knows. In none of those situations was I offered water first. I didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything useful to say. She said, "My government has a consular presence it is establishing in the Sondrath Drift. The infrastructure requirements include a maintenance and engineering coordination office." She paused. "The posting would be based here. This station, refitted and upgraded." I looked at her. She said, "We reviewed the station records. Your maintenance log is exceptionally complete." I said, "I try to be accurate." She said, "The compliance record from KL-7 is also in the file." A pause. "The notation that you were interviewed regarding an unauthorized juvenile passenger and stated that you had observed nothing unusual." I said, "That's what the file says." She looked at me with those silver eyes. "You lied to a compliance officer." I said, "I told him I hadn't observed anything unusual in the conduit systems or service areas." I thought about it. That was true from a certain angle. What I found wasn't unusual. It was exactly what it appeared to be. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The carved figure. Do you still have it?" There was something in the question, the way it landed in the air of the receiving bay, formal and composed, and with a vulnerability underneath it that her formal composure was not entirely concealing. 14 years. She had been carrying that question for 14 years, or something like it. I reached into my chest pocket. I keep the carved figure on the shelf at night. In the day when I'm on shift, and this is a thing I have done for 14 years without being entirely sure why, I keep it in my chest pocket. The left one, over the sternum, where the breast pocket sits. It rides there through filter inspections and pressure tests and atmospheric diagnostics, and all the long, ordinary hours of a maintenance coordinator's day. And I had not once thought about why I kept doing it, because the honest answer was not the kind of thing I was in the habit of examining. I held the figure out to her. She looked at it. Then she reached out and with 2 fingers, a deliberate gesture, a familiar one, she touched the small figure at the base of it, the small one at the tall one's feet. She said, "My great-grandmother carved this. She gave it to my grandmother. My grandmother gave it to my mother. My mother gave it to me when we knew I had to travel." She looked up at me. "It is, in our tradition, given in the moment of greatest trust. When you have nothing else and you give this, you are saying, 'I place myself in your hands.'" I looked at the figure. She said, "I offered it to you in the conduit and you gave it back." I said, "It wasn't mine." She said, "You were right. I wasn't ready to give it yet. I was testing." A small pause. "You passed the test and you didn't know it." I said, "What was the test?" She said, "Whether you would take something that was given." I thought about that. A man who takes what's offered, even when offered by someone with nothing. I thought about compliance officers and the kind of quiet understanding they had about the things that moved through their zone. and about the various individuals I had met over my career who had taken things that were given without any particular thought for what the giving had cost. I said, "You offered it again the night we left." "Yes." I said, "I took it that time." "Yes." Something shifted in her expression. "I know, I watched you put it in your chest pocket." She looked at the figure in my hand. "You have been carrying it." I said, "It seemed like the right place for it." She was quiet for a long time. Then she took the figure from my hand and she held it in both of hers, the way she'd held the canteen and the conduit, both hands, the grip of someone who has been rationing something and isn't quite ready to trust that there's more where it came from. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. Said, "My mother did not survive the border period. My father reached the independency 2 years after I did. He died of a pulmonary illness 3 years ago. The faction that was looking for me has been dissolved by the realignment. My lineage is no longer a target." She said the last word with a slight care that told me she had chosen something more moderate than the word she'd first thought of. "I serve the new sovereignty government as a consular coordinator for the outer system territories. It is work I am suited for." I said, "I'm sorry about your parents." She looked at me. "I know," she said, which was a strange thing to say and also somehow exactly right. I said, "The consular posting, the engineering coordination office." She said, "Yes." I said, "You're offering me a job." She said, "I'm offering you a reason to stay somewhere that will become considerably more comfortable than it currently is." A pause. "Also, yes, a job, a real one with a proper grade and compensation." I said, "I have a job." She said, "You have a posting that exists because someone decided you needed to disappear quietly, and which has persisted because no one has thought to revisit the decision." That was accurate. I had known it was accurate for approximately 14 years and had not found it productive to dwell on. I said, "Why here? You could establish a consular office in a system that already has infrastructure." She said, "I could." She looked at the carved figure in her hands. "Yedril 9 has good bones according to the engineering survey, and a maintenance coordinator whose log is exceptionally complete." She paused. "And it is where you are." I said, "You came here for me." She didn't quite look at me when she said it, which was the most honest version of it. "I came here because this was the right location for the office, and because you were here. Both things are true." I thought about the compliance officer's interview. I thought about Gorse and the administrative file notation and the reassignment notice with its careful neutral language. I thought about the Tessavar and Orve done and the fuel coupling side hatch and 19 minutes through the maintenance conduit. I thought about a small creature in the dark holding a canteen in both hands. I said, "The carved figure, what are you going to do with it?" She held it out to me. I looked at her. She said, "It belongs in your chest pocket. That seems to be where it lives now." I took it. I put it back in my chest pocket, the left one, over the sternum. She watched me do it with the same expression she'd had in the conduit when I'd put it there the first time, something settling, something completing. The aide with the document case cleared his throat quietly. She said without looking at him, "In a moment." She looked at me. I said, "When do the refit crews arrive?" She said, 6 weeks. The first supply hauler brings the structural assessment team. Construction phase runs approximately 14 months, depending on the atmospheric system complexity." She paused. "I understand you have opinions about atmospheric systems." I said, "I have opinions about atmospheric systems done properly." She said, "Good, I will need those opinions." The aide cleared his throat again. She turned to him and said something in Varath, too fast for me to follow, though I caught one word in trade pidgin that approximately meant "be patient," and he subsided. She turned back to me. "I will need to review the station's current infrastructure before the assessment team arrives, if you're available." I said, "I'm the maintenance coordinator. I'm always available." She said, "Then we should start with the atmospheric processors." The ghost of something in her face, not quite a smile, not for a moment yet, but the place where a smile eventually comes from. "I understand they've been giving you trouble." I said, "They've been giving everyone who worked here trouble. I just happened to be the first person to read the original specifications." She said, "Show me." We walked out of the receiving bay and down the main corridor toward the atmospheric maintenance section, and the aide followed with his document case, and the security officer followed the aide, and the station was quiet around us with the particular quiet of a place that has been holding its breath for a long time. I showed her the primary filtration loop, and then the secondary, and then the distribution network that I'd rewired 3 years ago, and she asked questions that were specific and informed, and that told me she had done the engineering survey thoroughly. She moved through the maintenance sections without hesitation. She had studied the layout. She'd come prepared. At one point, passing through the atmospheric sub-bay, not the same one, of course. Yedril 9 has its own geography. She paused and looked at the storage shelf along the near wall and the folded thermal blanket on it, which I keep there as a matter of habit because maintenance work is cold work, and a folded blanket on a shelf costs nothing. She looked at it for a moment. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We kept walking. That evening, Yedril 9 runs on a 28-hour cycle, which sits slightly better with my biology than Kale 7 ever did. I sat in my quarters after the delegation had retired to the guest section, and I looked at the shelf. The transit almanac, the mountain range picked, the calibration tool, the space where the carved figure usually sits, which was empty tonight because the figure was in my chest pocket where it belonged. In 6 weeks the refit crews would arrive. In 14 months the station would be a different place. The carved figure would be in my chest pocket throughout, as it had been for 14 years, and the station would be breathing properly because I had wired it correctly, and the atmospheric processors would be running to specification, and Vane, Consular Coordinator Vane, which was her title, which I was going to have to get used to, would be doing whatever work a consular coordinator does in an outer system territory, and I would be doing what I have always done, which is making sure the systems work and the air is clean, and the water runs, and the things that need to hold together hold together. A child needed a janitor once. She still does, I suppose. The scale has changed. The work is the same. I turned off the lamp and went to sleep, and the station breathed around me in the dark, and whatever you want to call what settled in my chest that night, relief or completion, or the long-deferred acknowledgement of a debt the universe had apparently decided to pay, it was quiet, and it was earned, and it was enough.